several times a year and is made possible by a gift from Dennis and Debra Scholl. The Scholls have been generous supporters of the museum in many ways, including a gift of art, many pieces currently on view, including the extraordinary installation in the Bank of America Gallery here on the first floor, the project gallery right down here, which I know many of you have seen prior to coming to this talk, where we have Simon Starling's inverted retrograde theme, USA, House for a Songbird. When discussing this series with Dennis and Debra, they were delighted by the possibility of having Simon speak, not only because he is a great artist, but because the piece we now have in the PAMM collection was highly influential to how they began thinking about building their private collection. When they first saw it in the gallery in New York, the depth of ideas and discourse around it stuck with both of them, and in Dennis's words, they just had to have it. In spite of the sheer scale of the work being larger than most works you would collect for a domestic private collection, and this is when it struck them that their role of collectors, and I'm paraphrasing here, that their role of collectors could also be to share the excitement for art with the broader public, and now we are grateful to be able to share this piece with them here at PAMM. And since this is the first in that series, I just wanted to take a moment to thank Debra and Dennis, who can't be here today. And now I'm very excited to introduce Simon Starling, who visits us from Copenhagen. Starling graduated from the Glasgow School of Art in 1992, and he was recipient of the Turner Prize in 2005, and has had his work in prestigious collections around the world. He has presented numerous critically acclaimed solo exhibitions, including Simon Starling Metamorphology at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and if you're in Chicago, you can see that there. It closes November 2nd. And other exhibitions include exhibitions at the Tate, at Mass MoCA in North Adams, Massachusetts, the Yokohama Triennial, the other group exhibitions at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, the Tamayo in Mexico City, as well as the Barbican Art Center in London, the Cadiz Art Foundation in Paris, and the Tate Triennial in Tate, Britain. And those are just a few of the places where Simon's exhibited his work that exists across mediums, both like the large-scale installation that we have here, that we're so pleased to engage in a dialogue not only about thinking about the Caribbean history and Caribbean architecture and all of the other multiple entry points that you could visit and think about his work in, but also in the medium of film, sculpture, and we're very happy to be able to introduce you to his work in his own words today. So please help me in joining Simon Starling. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is the scene that greeted me in my hotel when I arrived last night. And you'll understand why it's here later in the talk, but as an English sculptor, navigating the world, making exhibitions and so on, it struck me after a while that everywhere I went, Henry Moore had got there first. And so when I arrived last night, I just sort of, I don't know, this somehow had to go into the talk. It's apparently the biggest Henry Moore sculpture in private hands, and the hotel, they told me, was built around the sculpture, which was actually helicoptered in through the roof at some point. So yeah, that was pretty exciting to come across. And as I say, it'll kind of make sense when I start to talk about some of the work later on. But it also makes sense in this one of the things that I wanted to sort of talk about today was this notion of what you could call perhaps sort of mutable objects. Objects that on one hand seem to have a kind of fixed physicality, and yet are changeable, that they're kind of, when they're moved around the world, when their uses change, etc., they evolve. They seem to be stable as objects, but the more you sort of investigate them, they seem to be, yeah, mutable somehow. And I think the work that's here in the collection, the inverted retrograde theme USA House for a Songbird is sort of very much a work that talks to that sense of mutability. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but I wanted to sort of, first of all, sort of expand on this idea of mutability. This is the same work, in inverted commas, made of bronze in a field of sheep, which for me is a much more familiar context to find a Henry Moore sculpture than the foyer of Intercontinental Hotel. Yeah, I guess it talks to the way that a sculpture can have two incredibly different lives. The form of the sculpture is identical, but somehow in this hotel it gets kind of subsumed into the architecture. The materials are even the same, and then of course has a very different, slightly alien sense, like it's dropped from the sky into this field in England. This is not a work of art, but it's something that I often sort of put into talks to sort of address this idea of mutability, and also of what I call sort of slippage, which is something that happens when objects get made, when ideas get put in the world and then they're realized. This is actually a jug that I discovered in a holiday house in the small island of Bornholm in Denmark. And I sort of liked this jug, and I looked at the bottom of the jug and it said Hjort, which is the name of the pottery where it was produced. And I thought, oh, it would be nice to take a little souvenir back from my holiday, so I went to the Hjort pottery where they have a shop, and I looked around to try and find this jug, but there was no jug like it to be found. So I asked the woman at the desk, I tried to describe this jug to her, and then she didn't really know what I was talking about, so she handed me a piece of paper, and she said, "Can you draw your jug?" And so I sort of made this very over-exaggerated sketch of this jug, sort of over-emphasizing all the features on the jug that I'd only sort of come across a day earlier. And I gave the piece of paper to her, and she said, "Okay, I'll give it to one of our ceramicists, and we hope we can locate the design you're interested in." And so they sent me an email a few weeks later saying, "Yeah, we can make your jug for you, no problem." But what turned up in the post about a month later was not the jug that I'd been craving, but actually a perfect replica of my drawing of the jug. And so there was, which is something that it really is exactly how I drew it, and they replicated it perfectly. But that really wasn't the intention of making the drawing in the first place. It was to sort of identify a design that pre-existed. But somehow the object, through that process of miscommunication and sort of slippage, that the object has taken on this very special sense for me, and has sort of, I don't know, informed some thinking about making along the way. This is another object which is kind of also represents a kind of slippage in its creation. It is, for all extents and purposes, a glass slide used for academic purposes, and it's an image of a crater on the moon. But actually, the way it was made was, it was made in the 1870s, when, of course, the technology of telescopes and photography was fairly kind of basic still. And there were a couple of amateur scientists called Naismith and Carpenter who were working in Kent in England, and they wanted to make a series of illustrations for a book that they were writing about the moon, but they couldn't photograph the moon in a way that made sense for their illustration. So they made hundreds of drawings of the surface of the moon from their observations through a telescope. And these drawings were then used to make a series of plaster models. And then they took these plaster models into the garden in the sun, and they photographed them. And then they sort of passed them off as scientific illustrations for their rather flawed scientific book on the moon and the evolution of the moon's landscape. They believed that the craters on the moon were formed by volcanic activity and stuff like that. So there was, you know, the object is, it's, for me, again, it's a very sort of charged and interesting kind of thing in relation to this notion of the evolution of objects and the relationship between sort of science and art, in a way, I suppose. This is an image of the sun, and the little black dot which you see is Venus, and it's a still from a film which I'm going to show you a very short section of in a minute. And it's a film that it's a film that I was commissioned to make a piece for Oxford University a little while ago, to celebrate the 2012 transit of Venus, which has been a very, very important astronomical event historically, and was used initially as a way to try and calculate the distance between the Earth and the Sun, the astronomical unit, as it's called. And a lot of teams have been sent out into the world to try and observe this, this event from good vantage points. And for me, the event linked to the beginning of the technology surrounding cinema. There was a very, very important scientist called Jules Janssen, a French scientist, who was very, very important in introducing the use of photography into science. And he built a chronophotographic device which would allow for this moment, the beginning of the transit of Venus, to be photographed in a series of timed exposures. And this piece of technology was extremely important in the evolution of the movie camera. So again, there's it's kind of different kind of slippage there, but something that's designed to do one thing, but ends up kind of influencing a whole other area of life and sort of creativity, I suppose. One of the issues that they had as scientists, one of the reasons for photographing this event rather than just observing it through a telescope, was that there was this effect called the black drop, which meant that when Venus passed the edge of the sun, that it changed shape, or it appeared to change shape, and became a kind of drop shape. And that meant that to time accurately the transit from beginning to end was very, very difficult. So Jules Janssen believed that if you could do that retrospectively with a series of photographs, that you could be far more accurate, and therefore be far more accurate in your calculation of the distance between the Earth and the Sun. And this phenomena, black drop, was a kind of torment to science for a long time. And it's a little bit approximate to that thing when you put your fingers very, very close together and look at a bright light source, that there seems to be this phantom shape appears between the two tips of your fingers, as if it's filling the gap between the two things. This is a drawing by Captain Cook, who was one of the first scientists who, no, well, he wasn't, he was on a trip to document the transit of Venus from Tahiti when he discovered Australia. And him and his astronomer on board observed the black drop effect very, very clearly in Tahiti. And it was a huge frustration to their precise calculations back in the 1780s. This is Jules Janssen's drawing of the same phenomena. But I'll just show you just the first 4 minutes of that film, just to give you a sense of, it's a film it's about the evolution of the science around the transit of Venus, but it's also a film about film and how films get made, how narratives get structured, and also very much about old school film. It's not about video, it's about celluloid, it's about stuff that, physical stuff, material that's used to create images. And one of the things that prompted this work was the sense that I was probably going to be one of the last people to be able to film the transit of Venus on celluloid, because the next transit of Venus is not for over 100 years, and the chances are that all that technology will probably be gone by then. So it was this kind of marking this end to something which began somehow with the transit of Venus in the 19th century with Jules Janssen. So I'll just show you a little clip of that. I hope. Oh. Oh, no. That's better. Yeah. Thank you.
The enthusiastic attempts in 1874 and 1882 to use observations of the transit of Venus across the Sun to refine the measurement of the mean Earth-Sun distance, the so-called astronomical unit, are perhaps best known for the international nature of this vast collaborative undertaking, and in turn for their inaccuracies and ultimate failure. What is, however, less well known is that cinema, in part, is the illegitimate child of those 19th century scientific exertions. For many, Etienne Jules Maret's invention of the photographic rifle marks a key generative moment in the evolution of cinema. However, Maret's device was itself a direct descendant of the revolver photographique, a machine developed in 1874 by his colleague, the celebrated and highly innovative French astronomer Pierre César Jules Janssen. It was hoped that this controversial device that combined chronometry and photography would allow for analytical observations without human error, based on repeated exposures made of the transit in geographically remote locations around the globe. While the 1874 transit, itself a quintessential, if reductive, cinematic experience, a shifty planetary protagonist projected by a vast bulb-like sun onto the imaginations of an earthbound audience, may not have greatly enhanced our understanding of the solar system, it could certainly be argued that Janssen's innovative approach to chronophotography had a considerable impact on the future of cinema.
That's just a little extract to give you a sense of how it sort of functions as a film. So always kind of cutting between the sort of the making of the film and the sort of subject of the film, the narrative of the film. Yes. I'm going to now, just having sort of introduced this notion of sort of mutability in a way, and of slippage. I thought I would just talk about some early works from where this kind of idea evolved in the work, I suppose. And one of the early works, it's in a way a fantastically simple work, but fantastically complicated to realize. It's a work that, in a way, somehow sort of riffs on the Duchamp bicycle wheel, the ready-made, the first ready-made, but takes two ready-made objects and then remakes them. So in some sense, it's a kind of inverse of a ready-made, because what actually you saw in the gallery was a bicycle and a chair, and one object had been made or remade using the metal from the other. So you had these two kind of handmade sort of reconstructions of a mass-manufactured object. So they bore, in a way, all the scars of this transition, this transmutation of material from one form to the other. And they were shown in an exhibition space in two sides of a space with a glass sheet in between the two. And on the sheet is a text that just like a kind of simple recipe for the work, a description of what's happened, the metal from one object being used to build the other and vice versa. And also, in doing that, basically it's like a kind of elaborate detour to get back to where you started. So you end up with two objects which are essentially a bicycle and a chair. But in order to get there, you've gone on this crazy sort of labor-intensive detour. And what that means is that the work involved in that is kind of put center stage in a way. The sort of activity of labor, the activity of making becomes the subject in a way of the work. And it's something that has kind of haunted my work ever since then. This idea of it's a bit like when you get a DVD box set of your favorite kind of TV series, and there's a sort of making of DVD there as well. And I'm interested in the making of DVD more than I am in the TV series in a way. It's that kind of sense of interrogating the making of things. There's a lot of pictures of upside-down boats in this talk, and this is the first. It's a work called Blue Boat Black, which was made in Marseille in 1997, and it involved, sort of cutting a rather long story short, taking a huge Victorian museum display case from Scotland, where I was living at the time, to Marseille, where I did a residency, and using the wood, the mahogany from that, to build a fishing boat. Then going fishing in the waters around Marseille, and eventually catching some fish. This is a very young me. Then the boat was handed over to some charcoal burners who made the boat into charcoal. And some of the charcoal was used to cook the fish that had been caught in the boat. So it's this very simple little sort of perverse sort of economic model for something, I suppose. And the work was then exhibited as the sort of the detritus somehow of this activity, with these texts on the wall, also made with the charcoal, which is a list of the fish that were caught in Marseille with the boat. This is nothing by me. This is a painting of Francis Bacon, the artist, the painter. It's him as a very young man. It's a painting made by Roy de Maistre, who was Francis Bacon's lover for a while. And Francis Bacon began his career not as a painter, but as a furniture maker. And it's something that he very rapidly kind of, what would you say, kind of exorcised from his CV. He didn't want anything to do with his early life as a furniture maker, but somehow it was an important moment in his life, in his development as an artist as well. He, in 1926-27, he spent a year in Berlin, and at that time he saw a lot of modernist furniture that was being made by the Bauhaus, and also in Paris he saw furniture there, as well as his first ever contact with the work of Pablo Picasso, which was perhaps a more important experience in the long run. But he came back to London and he immediately set up a small company making furniture, and he did various kind of commissions. This is him in his studio later in life, with the only remaining remnant of his former life as a furniture maker. It's a circular mirror which featured in some of his furniture designs. This is in his incredibly messy studio. And there's the mirror, as it was in the late 20s, early 30s, in his showroom. He designed rugs, desks, all sorts of furniture, tables. This is one of his tapestries. He designed a sofa for the artist Roy de Maistre also. This is a picture of Roy de Maistre's mother reading on the sofa made by Roy de Maistre. And this is de Maistre's studio with that sofa in it. Not a great design, the sofa, but more of his things. Very hard to find images of because, yeah, he sort of buried it in the... One of the things I came across when I was sort of researching this project was this very strange photograph on the web of a desk that was designed for Patrick White, the writer, the Australian writer who was living in London in the 20s and 30s and was kind of involved in the social circles around Francis Bacon and de Maistre, and Bacon designed a writing desk for Roy de Maistre, which he was extremely happy about and excited by. But later, de Maistre moved back to Australia in 1947. At the end of the Second World War, he moved back to Australia, to Sydney, and he couldn't take any of his furniture with him, so he left it behind. And when he got back to Sydney, he took this photograph, which I found in an archive in Australia, of the desk to a furniture maker in Parramatta in Sydney, and asked him to make a replica of it for his house. But when he returned some weeks later to see the desk, what he found was this, which is a very kind of crude, clumsy kind of, yeah, looks more like it was made by IKEA than by Francis Bacon. So it became this kind of weird thing in his life, and apparently he never used it. He used to write at his dining table instead. But it's now in the museum in Canberra as a sort of testament to this strange process of evolution and slippage. And I took this as the sort of starting point for a work. The work is called Three White Desks, and it sort of evolved over quite a long period and involved essentially sending that photograph to a cabinet maker in Berlin. And the cabinet maker used the photograph to make this rather beautiful copy of the desk, as best he could with the information that he could gain from the original photograph. And then he took a photograph of his desk with his mobile phone and sent it to a cabinet maker in Sydney in Australia. And she made her desk from the information that she could gain from his little JPEG that she'd been sent. And then once her desk was completed, she did the same and sent an image to a guy in London who made this bizarre thing. I think there was a little bit of sort of ego involved and other things, but it somehow made for a very nice kind of trio of mutating desks. So now we're sort of getting closer to the inverted retrograde theme USA, which is outside. This is an image of the two guys on the right-hand side of the image, the sort of slightly deathly-looking characters are Adolf Loos in the hat and Arnold Schoenberg. Adolf Loos, of course, the modernist architect, and Schoenberg, the modernist composer. And I was invited in 2001, I think it was, to make a project for the Secession, the very elegant, very beautiful galleries in Vienna. And at that time, I was very much sort of using modernist architecture as a way to sort of orientate myself in the world. Perhaps in the same way that I will later talk about Henry Moore somehow. Because pretty much everywhere you go in the world, there's some sort of examples of that. And it's a way to sort of, locate yourself and orientate yourself. And so I started to sort of investigate architecture in Vienna, and of course, which has a very, very rich history of modernism, but also, of course, in music as well as architecture. And Schoenberg's 12-tone musical system, which became very, very important within the evolution of kind of modernist music, sort of a system that's based on it's a very structured system where you define a series of notes, and then you have various options as what to do with those notes. You can reverse them, so you play the first note, the last note first and the first note last, or you can invert them so that the octave is turned upside down, or you can do both of those things. So it's a very, very structured, very sort of rigorous way of generating music, which at times, of course, is very atonal and discordant, and for me, that sort of way of thinking started to rhyme with certain things that were going on in architecture, of course, at the time. This is a house designed by Adolf Loos, a small sort of semi-detached house, which is, of course, a perfect mirror image, one side to the other. This is it being restored, actually, in the 1980s or so. And I came across this image of a piano in one side of the house. And I sort of started to speculate in my slightly, I don't know, clumsy way about what the piano next door would look like if it was mirrored, as the architecture was. And that sort of course, resonated with this idea of mirroring that was implicit in Schoenberg's musical system. And so it was just this kind of speculation as to that. And that kind of evolved into a project which sort of looked at it sort of collapsed three, in a way, systems. One was the note row system of Schoenberg, 12-tone music. The other was the architecture of a piano. And the third was, I guess, the architecture of the exhibition space where the exhibition was happening, this beautiful modernist gallery space, which is kind of considered to be, in a way, the first ever white cube space. And it became, this is an image of a sort of a mapping, in a way, of all of the different kind of influences and images and ideas that sort of came together in the work in the end. And this is what people experienced when they went to the Secession. What we did was we took apart 2 pianos, and one of them was then inverted so that it was mirrored, so that everything was remade backwards, so that the high notes became the low notes and the low notes became the high notes, in effect. And what you saw in the gallery was a kind of a workshop type situation. And then we took the fluorescent lights. There happened, I discovered, quite by chance, to be 12 rows of fluorescent lights in the ceiling above the central space. And we lowered them into the gallery. And then using some fairly rudimentary sort of electronics, we transcribed a piece of Schoenberg 12-tone music onto the lights, which would flicker in sequence along this 12 rows of lamps above these 2 disemboweled pianos below. So it had a little bit of a feeling as a sort of dysfunctional factory space or something like that, with these kind of suspended fluorescent lights. This is the original frame for the strings, and then the red thing next to it is an exact mirrored version of that frame, which was then in turn cast in iron, etc. So again, it was very much foregrounding the process of making that inverted piano. And around about that time, I was invited to the Caribbean to go and do a residency in Trinidad, of all places. And I kind of jumped at the chance. And when I was in Trinidad, I took the opportunity to go and visit Puerto Rico, because when I'd been doing the research for the project in Vienna, I'd found out about this architect called Simon Schmiederer, who a Austrian emigre architect who ended up working for something called the IBEC Corporation, which was an organization set up actually by Nelson Rockefeller in 1947 to invest in developing countries. And they did a lot of work with agriculture primarily, but they also did some building projects. And one of the things they did was to build a huge area of sort of suburban housing in the suburbs of San Juan in Puerto Rico. And these neighborhoods are still there. They had this claim that they could build these prefabricated houses in one day. That was the whole kind of pitch of the project. So it was a kind of very fast-paced, perhaps slightly ill-considered sort of housing development. And Schmiederer built these houses to be very open. Of course, the weather's good. It's not like you need, you know, windows and walls to insulate, and the houses were built with very, very little in the way of, I mean, there were shutters on the windows, but no glass. And of course, what happened was that as time went on, the crime rate in Puerto Rico increased. People got nervous about living in these sort of open pieces of architecture, so they started to build grills, metal grills, into the windows of the buildings. So they became these very strange kind of cages in a way. And actually, people started, it became a way to sort of, I don't know, sort of gentrify your rather simple concrete prefab building, that you could bring some of your own character to the building through the design of these grills. So some of them are very elaborate and decorative and completely out of keeping with the architecture, the sort of functionalist architecture itself. And when when I was there, I just sort of had this weird sense of a kind of inversion of the people living in these kind of cages, and then all these beautiful birds flying around in the tropics, singing, and it seems like such a beautiful, strange sort of evolution of a piece of architecture that was made for a very different moment and with very much more sort of utopian, I suppose, notions at its heart. And so that, in a way, I suppose, was the beginnings of the thinking behind the work that is here at the museum. And again, I suppose, the Schoenberg note row system, this idea of mirroring and inversion, came into play in the thinking behind the way that piece was structured. And when I was in Puerto Rico, I went to the university architecture department where they have a library, and I found some of the plans from the IBEC building project, and made a lot of photocopies of these plans. And this is one of the aerial views. So, I mean, you get a sense of the kind of scale of these neighborhoods. There were places like, one is called Villa Contessa, one is called Villa Fontana. And so these plans became the sort of the nuts and bolts for my own kind of reconstruction, my own model of the two of these mirrored concrete prefab buildings, which you now see suspended from the ceiling of the museum. And they became, you know, the inversion of the humans living in cages with the birds flying around outside was then inverted once again, and they became homes for songbirds. This is an image of the work when it was first realized in New York. And we found two beautiful pieces of mahogany tree to sort of wedge the structures onto the ceiling of the gallery. So they do become like tree-like in a way, I suppose, these structures. One more image of one of the other facades. And I was working, I had a studio in New York for a month to build this work. And it was in a sort of, at that time, rather sort of rundown neighborhood in Brooklyn. And it was a place, it seemed, when we got there, where people came to dump stuff. So people would just come along, usually at nighttime, with their pickup trucks, and just throw stuff onto the street. Old, you know, building materials, whatever stuff was, you know, unwanted. And so there was this amazing kind of reservoir of materials just lying about in order to build these kind of models of this kind of dystopian modernist architecture. And I guess that work for me is very, very important in the development of a number of other works which came after it. I've been living in Denmark for quite a while, and I've always been like interested in this, the way that they used to use Viking ships as shelters. In the winter, they would take their boats out of the water and literally just turn them upside down. And they would clad the sides of the boat with leather and create these kind of big halls, these pieces of architecture with the boats. And that was sort of a very inspiring kind of notion, and a very pragmatic way of using something that's normally carrying you around the world to sort of keep you warm in the winter when you're not sailing. And it kind of led to a number of projects. this is something called the Mahogany Pavilion, which is, was made for the Sao Paulo Biennale, which is in these beautiful Oscar Niemeyer buildings. And it's a boat that is actually, it's a very beautiful sailing boat from Scotland, but the boat was made with mahogany from Brazil. And so it's a kind of another sort of inversion of a journey. So to, in a way, return this boat to its kind of source and to sort of shift its sense. It's on the other side of the equator, I guess, so surely it should be upside down. I don't know. And it became a kind of, yeah, a very, very simple piece of architecture, perhaps the most simple piece of architecture, just a shelter in a way. And it's actually now found a home very appropriately in Theme, which is this big outdoor sculpture park in Belo Horizonte in Brazil. And they seem to have incredible resources there. And they said to me when they bought the work, when they saw it at the Sao Paulo Biennale, I'd always had this idea that it should be outside, but I never dreamt it would be really possible. And then, of course, my other fantasy was that it should be grown, it should be housed or installed among mahogany trees. And I asked them when they bought the piece, do you have any mahogany trees? And they said, no, but we can get some. So they brought to this sculpture park these huge, mature mahogany trees and planted them around my mahogany pavilion. So yeah, there it stands. And amazingly, it's kind of survived. It's extraordinary. I think they've just taken it down to give it a new coat of varnish and stuff. Here's another upside down boat. It's a canoe that was built for a film called Red Rivers, which evolved out of the story of a botanist going from he was not a botanist. He was working for the Museum of Natural History in New York. He was actually a German called Herbert Lang, and he was sent by the Museum of Natural History to the Congo in the beginning of the 20th century to go and bring back samples of material flora and fauna for the museum and to create these dioramas that they were working on at the time. And Herbert Lang was responsible for bringing back 2 okapi, which are these extremely shy and rare creatures that live in the very, very heart of the Ituri forest in the middle of the Congo. And so I sort of made a film which was actually a journey from Massamoka in North Adams in Massachusetts to New York City, to the Museum of Natural History, made in a canoe, which has kind of okapi stripes, and so it's a specially built strip canoe. And when it's carried by 2 people, it becomes like a kind of pantomime okapi in a way. It becomes this kind of creature. So the culmination of this trip through New York was this sort of walk through New York City up to the Museum of Natural History from the River Hudson, which we just rode down. It took 7 days to get from North Adams to New York City, but it's really the best way to enter New York City you can possibly imagine. It's great. Under the George Washington Bridge and alongside the park. And then we sort of pulled out the boat and walked up. The film is all kind of set in a darkroom. So what you're looking at, again, is the making of a series of photographs which appear as sort of still images in the film. And everything is bathed in this darkroom red light. And this is one of the final images in the film, the okapi in their diorama in the Hall of African Mammals. And then finally, in relation to boats and buildings and so on, just a quick note of another project which, has its history in the sort of lineage of the work here is Shed Boat Shed, which was a work that was originally made for a museum in Switzerland, in Basel, the Museum for Gegenwartskunst, the Museum for Contemporary Art, which is right on the edge of the River Rhine. And the River Rhine in Basel is an amazing river. It's a very, very powerful river. It's, full of mountain snow, melted snow, and which sort of crashes through the city and has really, in a way, shaped the evolution of the city. And everything is somehow connected to the river. And I knew that I wanted to make a project about the river somehow. And I borrowed a bicycle from the curator, Philip Kaiser, and took this trip out along the edge of the river, upstream. And I came across this shed, which was just standing there in a clearing with a paddle nailed on the side. And I was within the space of like 5 seconds, this project took shape in my mind. The paddle is for a Weidling, which is a long, 10-meter long wooden craft, a traditional riverboat, which is now mostly used for sport, but in the old days was used to transport goods across the river. And we called the guys that owned the shed, and they were immediately kind of excited and cooperative, and they said, well, basically we've been trying to get rid of this shed for years. You're welcome to it. And so we dismantled the shed piece by piece. We recorded it very, very rigorously, how it was built, where each piece went, numbered everything. And then we took it apart. And then we used the best of the wood from the shed to build a Weidling, which was quite an undertaking. This is the kind of spine of the boat being built. And then we loaded the remains of the shed into the boat and paddled downstream to the museum. And then we took the boat apart and rebuilt the shed. So you again, it's this crazy detour. You end up back where you started, but the object that you end up with is that object you started with, but plus all these layers of history, these layers of making, so it has strange holes in certain places and cuts. And when you walk into the shed, you can almost start to piece together the boat by looking at where the shed has been cut. The last sort of work which brings us back, the last two works I'm going to talk about, which brings us back to Henry Moore again, where we started the talk, in the foyer of my hotel. This is an image of a kind of replica of a Henry Moore sculpture that I made in Toronto in 2005. It's a steel copy of an originally bronze sculpture, and it's been in the Great Lakes for 18 months and played host to a colony of zebra mussels which are a kind of introduced species, a weed, if you like, in the Great Lakes. They came to the Great Lakes. I'm sure you guys know all about these things. They're now everywhere in North America. But they came to North America at the end of the Cold War, when trade began between the Black Sea, between Russia and the Great Lakes. And they got dumped in the bilge water of trading ships into the Great Lakes and have kind of taken off like crazy, and now have completely changed the ecosystem of the Great Lakes. The first time I ever went to Toronto to look at the space where I was making the show, the power plant it's called, which is on the waterfront in Toronto, I saw this bicycle which was completely covered in these small stripy mussels. And so it had just been fished out of the lake, and I sort of asked the curator about that. And of course, I have a long-standing interest in introduced species, and have made works with rhododendrons and cacti and other things, which are things that have popped up where they're not supposed to be. And so this story of the zebra mussel introduction was very, very interesting, and it sort of somehow seemed to collide with the introduction of Henry Moore into the Toronto art scene in the 1950s and 60s, where he became a huge presence there, at times a kind of controversial one. He made a lot of big public sculptures there. He donated a large group of works to the AGO, the museum there. And he was actually introduced to Toronto by the famous art historian Anthony Blunt, who was later discovered to have been a Russian spy working for the KGB, while at the same time he was the keeper of the Queen's pictures in London and so on, and ran the Courtauld Institute. So there just seemed to be these kind of very fragile, very interesting connections between this sort of introduction of these mussels at the end of the Cold War, and then the introduction of Henry Moore during the Cold War through Anthony Blunt, this spy, and so on and so on. And so this work came about, and this is what the piece looks like now. It's a rusty moor covered in these mussel shells from Lake Ontario. But in making that work, I sort of started to look at Henry Moore's sort of international career, and one of the projects that I came across was this work that he made in Chicago to mark the site of the first ever nuclear reaction, which was devised by Enrico Fermi, the Italian physicist, and was the beginning of the atom bomb project. Now, this project, while I sort of knew this story, the trigger for this project was a strange and a wonderful invitation from a museum in Hiroshima, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Hiroshima, to make an exhibition. And when I went to Hiroshima to see the museum, I discovered that they had a smaller version of this monument to the first nuclear reactor in Hiroshima, but under a different name. In Chicago, it's called Nuclear Energy, and in Hiroshima, it's called Atom Peace. And I was just completely amazed by how this one sculpture could have these two completely different lives, in a way. The museum in Hiroshima is full of sculptures that are trying to tussle with the atom bomb and the effects of the atom bomb. And there's Henry Moore's sculpture, which was a commission to celebrate the beginning of the atom bomb project. And it just struck me as being kind of extraordinary in a way. And so I started to work on a project for Hiroshima. It evolved quite slowly over a period of a couple of years. It involved initially a lot of research into the evolution of that very particular sculpture for Chicago, which in a way has its history in Henry Moore's early stone-carved masks, and later these helmet heads which he made after the Second World War in the 1950s. But in a way, its most sort of interesting kind of influence is perhaps this poster for CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, which was made the same year that Henry Moore made the small maquette for the sculpture in Chicago. And it's a kind of death's head, an image of a skull and a mushroom cloud, which was actually made by one of Henry Moore's neighbors, a graphic designer called Henrion. So it's very clear that Moore, who was also a supporter of CND in the beginning, would have known about this poster. It was a very famous image at that time within the art world, within graphics, the graphics world, etc. But what I discovered was that Henry Moore later, after, in fact, 6 years after he made the original maquette, which became the Chicago project, he tried to sort of, in a way, change the story. It's another of these sort of mutable objects. He changed the story of the evolution of that sculpture by introducing this elephant skull into its history. And he did that in a very weird theatrical way by bringing his photographer, who worked for him, into the studio 6 years after he'd made the maquette, and having Earl Jackson, the photographer, photograph him working on the maquette next to the elephant skull. So completely shifting the, sort of naturalizing the history of the sculpture and depoliticizing it in relation to its new home in Chicago, which struck me as being an incredible, a very, very interesting thing. This is Henry Moore with the Chicago sculpture outside the Neue National Gallery in Berlin. The sculpture was actually cast, the foundry was in Berlin, Noack, and he went with the sculpture to the Neue National Gallery just to sort of try it out in public space and see how it felt, which is also a kind of reflection of Henry Moore's kind of power, I suppose, at that time. And this is the piece that's in Hiroshima, the smaller atom piece. It's one of the first, one of the few sort of circular sculptures that Henry Moore made, and it's very much a death's head, a skull, very clearly. Now, this idea of a sort of sculpture with a double identity led me to thinking about no theatre, which is a kind of ancient tradition of masked Japanese theatre, in which everybody is kind of constantly, not everybody, but it's a very common thing for people to change their identities. So young people become old people, or the dead take on the form of living people. And of course men, because there's only male actors, take on the role of female actors by putting on a mask of a woman. So there was this sense that there was this kind of, this story of a sculpture which has a double identity, and to think about that in relation to no theatre seemed, I don't know, to hold lots of possibilities, to sort of piece together a kind of masquerade around the history of the evolution of this sculpture. And to do that, I contacted a wonderful mask maker who is a master no mask maker called Yasuo Michi, who lives in a very small, very modest apartment in Osaka, and from there makes these extraordinary, beautiful, labor-intensive objects. And we met and started to discuss developing a kind of set of hybrid masks for this proposition for a hybrid play, somewhere between a no play and a piece of sort of Western art history in a way. And I developed a series of characters to people this play. This is actually James Bond, who plays, I found a very beautiful play called Eboshi Ori, which is a play about a young noble boy trying to sort of escape from his past by disguising himself. And it just seemed to rhyme so clearly with this story of this sculpture that I just simply started to sort of populate that play. All the characters became other characters from the story of More's sculpture, the evolution of More's sculpture, which is essentially a kind of Cold War story. So you have James Bond from Goldfinger playing a gold merchant in the play, and you have Colonel Sanders playing an innkeeper in the No play, and you have Joseph Hirshhorn, who made his fortune from mining uranium at the beginning of the sort of nuclear age, and also was a huge collector of Henry Moore's sculptures as a kind of a bandit called Kumusaka, who's the kind of villain of the piece in a way. And then you have Henry Moore as this hat maker who makes a disguise for the young noble boy, and so on and so on. And what I did was I spent some time filming Yasuo making the masks, which is a beautiful and you know, time-consuming and sort of ancient craft. And then the narratives, or the two narratives, one from the No play and one from the story of the evolution of Henry Moore sculptures, are overlaid onto the images of those characters being kind of born in the form of masks. It's the Henry Moore mask. They always write these beautiful inscriptions onto the wooden mask before they're painted. So the inscription gets buried under 9 layers of gesso and paint. And Yasuo told me that he wrote on Henry Moore's forehead, "Ban the bomb," in Japanese, which I was kind of shocked and surprised by, but also, so it's there underneath all this paint now, forever. And this is, yeah, the James Bond mask. And the whole film takes place in this tiny little studio where Yasuo works. And just to finish the talk, because I realize I've kind of gone on a little bit, I'm just going to show you a little bit of that film. It's just a section where you get introduced to the character of the hat maker and Henry Moore, which will just give you a sense of how the film was functioning. This is the hat maker's wife is played by Anthony Blunt, the art historian, who, of course, in the play she has a kind of secret past, which, of course, Anthony Blunt as a spy also had. So this is a very good example of how the masks evolved as this kind of hybrid thing between these very stylized, very beautiful traditional No masks, and then a kind of Western portrait, if you like. Henry Moore's hair. And these are some images of the final masks. The backsides are almost as beautiful as the fronts, actually. And then one of the characters was represented by a hat. This is the hat of Oddjob, the kind of villain from Goldfinger, who sort of decapitates people with his bowler hat. And then this is how the work was originally shown in a two-sided space with a screen hanging in the middle. And on one side the film is projected, on the other side there's a kind of mirror foil into which these characters stare. And this is the film as it's seen, and you sit on the floor down at the level of Yasuo and his workshop. So just to finish, I'll play a little bit of, hang on a second, exit. I'll play a little bit of the film, Project for a Masquerade. Doing full screen, here we are. And if anybody has any questions or anything afterwards, I'd be very happy to answer them.
The messenger's fleeting appearance on stage is enough to prompt Ushiwaka's late-night visit to a hat maker to seek assistance in creating a disguise. He decides to cut his hair and wear a highly encoded eboshi hat folded to the left, a hat outlawed by the local ruling Taira clan, in order that he might be mistaken for an Eastern boy and so escape unnoticed. Despite the lateness of the hour and the controversial nature of his request, the kindly hat maker agrees to produce the hat. The arrival of Ushiwaka at the hat maker's shop sends shockwaves through the lives of the hat maker and his wife. In return for making a perfect left-folding eboshi so late at night, Ushiwaka presents the hat maker with a sword. At first, the hat maker refuses the sword as payment, but eventually presents it to his wife. On seeing the sword, his wife immediately starts to cry and admits to her bemused husband that she has a secret past. She reveals that she is in fact Lady Akoya, the sister of Kamada Masakiyo, an ally of Ushiwaka's dead and defeated father, Lord Yoshitomo. Lord Yoshitomo had sent this charmed sword, known as Konento, to Ushiwaka's mother as a gift, and the hatmaker's wife had been the messenger whom he charged to carry it, and who still mourns the loss of her former master and the regime he was unable to sustain. As with all female roles in No theatre, the hatmaker's wife is played by a masked man, in this case the once celebrated art historian and infamous Soviet spy, Sir Anthony Blunt. The youngest son of the Reverend Stanley Vaughan Blunt and Hilda Violet Master, Anthony Blunt spent much of his early life in Paris, became fluent in French, and had close contact with the artistic culture of the city. He was educated at Marlborough College and then Cambridge University, studying maths, modern languages, and finally pursuing graduate studies in art history. While at university, Blunt became a member of the Cambridge Apostles, a largely Marxist secret society, and after visiting the Soviet Union in 1933 was recruited by the NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. In 1945, Anthony Blunt was appointed surveyor of the King's Pictures, and 2 years later became Professor of Art History at the University of London and Director of the Courtauld Institute of Art. While it is clear that Blunt's great passion as an art historian was for the paintings of Nicolas Poussin and the architecture of the Italian Baroque, and that his strong political views at times strained his relationship to avant-garde art, he wrote with great conviction on the work of a number of contemporary artists, most notably Pablo Picasso, whose painting Guernica he described as the last great painting in the European tradition, and Henry Moore, whom he described in decidedly un-Marxist fashion as a sculptor of genius. Following studies at Leeds School of Art and the Royal College of Art, and travels in France and Italy, our hat maker, Henry Spencer Moore, established a studio in the avant-garde milieu of late 1920s Hampstead. Close neighbours included artists, writers, architects, philosophers and activists, such as Naum Garbo, Herbert Reed, Erno Goldfinger and F.H.K. Henrion. He is said to have joined the Communist Party in the 1930s and was an active campaigner for peace and resistance to the rise of fascism. During World War II, Moore became an official war artist, making drawings during the Blitz of sheltering figures in the London Underground, a process which was later restaged for a documentary film, but was finally forced to leave London when his Hampstead home was bombed. With his émigré Russian wife Irina, Moore made a new home and studio in the rural setting of Perry Green in Hertfordshire, from where, supported by influential art historians such as Herbert Reed, Kenneth Clark and Anthony Blunt, he established a truly global reputation as the most important British sculptor of his generation. The warlike mask of our hero Ushiwaka is based on a sculpture which itself had a complex early life and achieved what might be described as a double identity, Henry Moore's atom piece. This multifaceted sculpture, a domed form on a rough-hewn tripod, was renamed Nuclear Energy on the insistence of its commissioners, the Chicago University, for fear that the use of the word peace, P-I-E-C-E, might be confused with peace, P-E-A-C-E, and who selected the work to mark the site of the first self-sustaining nuclear reaction, Chicago Pile No. 1, the beginning of what was known, much to the displeasure of Chicago, as the Manhattan Project, and which led at great speed to the building of the first atomic bomb. Henry Moore's monumental sculpture, Nuclear Energy, started life in December 1963, some months before the approach from the Chicago Commission, as a tiny plaster maquette with clear links to F.H.K. Henrian's landmark poster for the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, designed in the same year, and indeed to the campaign's three-legged logo. Despite being an early supporter of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, Moore later attempted to distance himself from these more political associations by commissioning the photographer Errol Jackson to make a series of photographs of him working on the long finished maquette next to an elephant skull, which came into his possession after the maquette's original completion. The two-stage scaling up of the sculpture generated a working model which Moore continued to refer to as Atom Piece, and from which a bronze edition was cast. In 1986, and seemingly on the insistence of the by then dying artist, No. 1 of the edition was sold to the Hiroshima City Museum of Contemporary Art.
Okay. Gives you a sense of it somehow. Thank you. Yeah?
Thank you. So the narratives are just woven so beautifully into the objects and into the films, and my question is, what role does writing play in your practice? Do you do a lot of writing?
Increasingly, I do, actually. I must say, I think a fear of writing was probably why I became an artist in the first place. I'm actually a little bit dyslexic, and for me it was, I don't know, language was always like a horror. So I sort of escaped to the art room at school and all those kinds of things. But slowly, I've started to sort of enjoy it more and more. And I guess it's just been a very, I mean, because of the sort of process-based, sort of investigative nature of the work, it's become a very important tool in not only in the making of the films, for example, but just in the kind of the sort of mediating of the work. The making of books has been very important to me, and that's always accompanied by writing and so on and so on. So it's something that I've sort of grown to love. I mean, but partly because I'm very slow at it. But somehow when you've finished something, a piece of writing, and it works in some way, then that is one of the most satisfying things there is, I think. So yeah, it's been, I mean, it began in a way with just these very small, like writing descriptions of things, like with the work made ready with the bike and the chair, just formulating a very clear description of something that's happened, and then slowly became more and more elaborate until you end up with these rambling kind of film sort of voiceovers and things, which I think are I've been very lucky to work with some very, very good actors, and they've managed to make sense of my ridiculously long sentences, which shouldn't be on film at all, you know, to give them some sort of shape. So yeah, no, but I've sort of grown to love it, I guess. Is that an answer to your question? I don't know. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah? Well, it's in this work, it's never staged, but it kind of exists as a proposition, I guess. And while part of me thinks that that's probably the best thing, there have been a lot of people have asked me the same question, and one person in particular has kind of persuaded me that it might be interesting to develop something for the stage, and that scares the hell out of me. But because I don't know, I find the theatre a very sort of strange and difficult sort of space, but which I think is very common among visual artists. But I just thought, why the hell not try it and see? And so, yeah, I don't think it's not really going to be a sort of transcription of this thing onto the stage, but I think something else is kind of brewing, which I hope will be realized sometime in 2016, but it's still a little bit up in the air. 2016 is a kind of important date because in 1916, 100 years prior to that, W.B. Yeats, the poet, wrote a series of no-inspired plays, which were kind of based on Irish folk tales. But he'd been exposed to no theatre through Ezra Pound, who was working for him at the time as his kind of secretary. And he was reading and thinking about no plays for the first time. And he subsequently wrote the most famous is a play called At the Hawk's Well, which is actually interestingly now being performed in Japan by no theatre companies as a kind of no text. So there's something kind of interesting in that trajectory, and I don't know what's going to come of it at the moment, but yes, it's being thought about.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. You spoke about orientation through architecture, and is that beyond just the physical expression of a building and then you orient yourself through that, or is there something else as orientation through architecture?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I have an answer for it, but I mean, I suppose on a very basic level, one of the things that you do as a visual artist, especially if you work in the way that I do, is to negotiate architecture the whole time, to find ways to exhibit work in particular spaces, to often have work very clearly generated from particular exhibition opportunities or what have you. So it's sort of, there's sort of a very sort of pragmatic thing on the one hand about how you make stuff work and be articulate in architectural space, and then there's another thing which is sort of using architectural form and sort of narrative, if you like, to sort of generate things, to sort of inspire works. And sorry, this is a bit of a woolly answer. Yeah. I mean, I think it's always been, actually my grandfather was an architect, and I think for a few years I thought I was going to be an architect too. And then I sort of discovered what a long process it was to become an architect, and it kind of scared me off a little bit. But it could have happened. And yeah, I guess I suppose I'm somebody who, yeah, I feel like I have some sort of, I don't know, yeah, sensitivity to it, or yeah, some kind of understanding of it. It's always there or thereabouts in the way I think about the world. So Yeah, it's nice to see this work here in this museum, which is all kind of pillars, and then you've got these trees hanging. I think Emily was telling me that the building was kind of built from the top down, that they built the ceiling and then hung everything off the roof, which is a beautiful kind of notion, I think. So it's sort of, I don't know, there's something nice about that work being here, I think, but quite by chance, and you know, yeah, a good collision. A bad answer to your question, but you know, forgive me. Are you an architect? Okay. Yeah. And thanks to the Scholls for making it all possible as well, Deborah.